Hey guys, I'm very excited for another episode of Show About Science. This is your host, Nate, and today we will be talking about salps. Do you know what a salp is? If not, then stay tuned. Hi, it's Nate from the Show About Science. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Larry Madin, and I'm a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod in Massachusetts.
So, could you tell me what salps are?
What salps are? I'm glad you asked because not very many people know anything about salps, and that's something that I have worked on for many years. Salps are transparent, gelatinous, jelly-like critters that live in the ocean. And you might think that they are jellyfish, but they're actually quite different from jellyfish, even though they look kind of the same. They're mostly about a half an inch to maybe 4 or 5 inches long, so they're big enough to see easily, but they don't ever come very close to the shore, so people don't very often get a chance to see them. And the reason that they're interesting is because they can consume a lot of the algae that grows in the ocean, the algae that we call phytoplankton, which is tiny single-celled plants. And that's the kind of plant life that the ocean has compared to what we have on land with trees and shrubs and flowers. But these salps are really good at eating all of that material. That's how they get their food, and that's how they grow. And they can grow really fast, and they can make really big populations, and then they can become food for other things. One of the things that really likes to eat them are certain kinds of sea turtles and various other kinds of fish. The thing that is peculiar about them is that even though they look like a jellyfish and they kind of act like a jellyfish, they don't sting because they don't have any stinging tentacles, and they're actually more closely related to people, to you and me, than they are to the jellyfish.
So, which one is the plural? Salps or salpas?
Well, I just say salps myself. And sometimes people say salpa because that is actually the zoological name, the genus name for many of the species. As you know, animals have a name that has a genus name and a species name. So for many of them, that genus name, the first part of their name is salpa, and then the second part is something else. So there's one called Salpa maxima, and as you might guess, that's a really big one. There's another one that's called Salpa fusiformis, and that name fusiformis means it's sort of long and tapered in shape. So I just call them salps.
I'm going to be calling them salpas.
Okay.
So, how did you first get interested in the salpas?
I first got interested in these when I was a student in college, and I saw some of them in a jar because they were a preserved sample in a class that I was taking, and I'd never seen anything like them before, and the teacher didn't know what they were or what they did. So I got curious about them, and later on, when I did my graduate studies in zoology, I decided I wanted to study salps.
How many people know about the salpa?
Not very many. I bet a lot more people will know about it now after they hear your show, and that's great. But, you know, people who are marine biologists or who study life in the ocean probably will know about salpas. They were sort of discovered about 200 years ago. And so there's a small number of people who study these things and they know about them. But since they don't come close to shore very often, most people, if they go to the beach or something, or even if they're in their boats near the shore, they're not likely to see them. Most of them live way out in the ocean and sometimes fairly deep, but mostly near the surface, but just not anywhere near land. And because they're kind of soft and jelly-like, they're often not very easy to catch even when we go out with our sampling nets because they get broken and damaged. So what we've often done was to go scuba diving out in the middle of the ocean, and then we can swim around with the salps, and we can collect them up, and we can put them in bottles, and we can bring them back and study them alive that way.
So you said that they're more closely related to you and me than jellyfish. Tell me what that means.
Well, it means if you look at their body structure, they have parts of their body that are very similar to another kind of sea creature that's called a sea squirt. And its zoological name is a tunicate. And we know that these tunicates, by studying their evolutionary history, belong to the same branch of evolution that vertebrates, which of course we are vertebrates, we have backbones, arose from. So if you go back in evolution, you will find that people and all the other vertebrates have a common ancestor with these things which now have become the salps. And if you go much, much farther back in the evolutionary history of life, you will finally get back to where you find the jellyfish and some of those organisms, and they went off in a different direction. So we're on the side that belongs to the salps, and the jellyfish are in a different part of the evolutionary history.
If you see a sulpa, then how do you know that it is a sulpa and not something else?
Okay, well, they do have a pretty characteristic appearance, and like I said, they're sort of jelly-like, but they're like a tube. They're hollow. So if you imagine a little tube that you can see through it, but it has an opening at each end and it's hollow inside, and the salps actually swim along through the water by jet propulsion. So they are like little rocket engines in the ocean, and what they do is they take water in the front of that little tube, and by squeezing their muscles, they can make the water go out the back end of the tube, and that causes the animal itself to swim along through the water. And while they're doing that, the water that comes through their body, they have a little filter system inside, and that filter system takes out the food, the phytoplankton, the algae cells that I mentioned, and that's how they collect their food. So they really look pretty distinctive, and the other really interesting thing about them is that sometimes they are all connected together in a very long chain of some kind. The reason that that happens is that their reproductive system produces lots and lots of little salps all connected together. So if you've ever seen somebody cut out a string of paper dolls out of paper, where you fold up the paper, you cut out the shape of the doll, and you unfold it, and you have all these little figures connected together, that's kind of what the chain of salps is like. They're all connected, and they're all the same. And so sometimes you see just a single one swimming along, and sometimes you see a chain of them that might have hundreds all connected together, and it looks like a big snake in the water, and it might be 20 feet long.
Now, the thing that I want to do is I want to guess the anatomy of the sulpa.
Okay.
So the thing that I think is that they have a little opening that opens and shuts and opens and shuts, and that's water in for them to not only eat but also to swim, and then everything goes along. And then there's a filter that separates water from food. Water just goes along, and then the food goes into a tube that leads to its stomach, and then it digests it with all of its mucus, and then there's a tube leading out, and that's its poop.
That's right. You got it. That's exactly how it works. And it's got a few other little features. It has an eye, and the eye is not, it doesn't really have a head, so it can't have its eyes on its head. It has the eye in the middle of its back. And we don't actually know why it has an eye in the middle of its back, but that's where it is. And we know that it's sensitive to light. So that may help it decide or understand how deep it is in the ocean by how bright the light is from sunlight. But you've got the whole salp system down there, and the thing you mentioned at the end is that at the end of all this, out comes the salp poop. And that is actually kind of important because that salp poop contains a lot of the material that it ate, and it sinks down to the bottom of the ocean. It sinks down pretty fast. And one of the things that does is take some of the phytoplankton, some of the algae, basically turn it into salp poop and send it back down deep into the ocean, and that does what we call sequester, which means it takes it out of the circulation in the ocean. And the reason we care about that is that it contains carbon, and that carbon originally came from the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide. It got turned into the algae, it got eaten by the salp, it got made partly into salp poop, and it sank down deep in the ocean, and from there it can't really get back up into the atmosphere. And so effectively this helps to take carbon dioxide, and as you know from your other programs, that's part of why we have global warming, and it helps to take that out of the air, out of the atmosphere, and send it down deep in the ocean. So that's a good thing that we think salps are doing to help us with the global warming problem.
Everybody clap for the SOPA.
We think they're great.
Thank you for being on the show.
Okay, you're sure welcome, Nate. Good to talk to you.
There you have it, folks. The show about science is complete. Dad, you can shut the recording off.